Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu, sitting in for Riz Khan. On today's show, we look at how the multi-billion-dollar illicit drug industry in Afghanistan is financing groups like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. These are some of the facts and figures. Afghanistan produces more than 90% of the world's opium, an industry worth $4 billion. The United Nations estimates 400 million of those funds are funneled to the Taliban each year. The main production center for Afghan opium is Helmand province in the south of the country, a known stronghold for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda insurgency. Most of the heroin produced in the region is smuggled into markets in Europe, Asia and the Middle East. So far, NATO and US counter-narcotics programs have done little to stop the drug lords. The Taliban insurgency has been gaining strength in recent months, and violence in Afghanistan is now at its highest level since US-led forces ousted the Taliban more than 7 years ago. Later this year, thousands more US troops will move into Afghanistan. Many say it's a make or break year for Afghan security. On today's show, we ask, how is the vast drug trade fueling an insurgency in Afghanistan? And remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and then take part. And of course, we also welcome your phone calls on the show. Joining me today to discuss this issue from Denver, Colorado, is Gretchen Peters. She's an award-winning journalist who's covered Pakistan and Afghanistan for more than a decade. She spent 5 years traveling the border areas between the two countries to research and write her new book, Seeds of Terror: How Heroin is Bankrolling the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Gretchen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I've read your book. It's really great. It's an excellent book. And in essence, what it says is that groups like the Taliban are now largely financed by drug money. And I want to ask you, how big is that support and how new is this particular source of funding for them?
Well, I searched back through government archives, researched dozens of officials. The Taliban movement was very close to major drug cartels and traders, corrupt traders along the border area since its very inception. However, since 2001, what we've seen is the insurgency integrating itself through the drug trade. Previously, they just taxed farmers who grew poppy. Increasingly, they started providing protection for drug shipments leaving the area. Then they started taxing drug refineries. Now you hear of Taliban commanders actually running refineries. This is a very similar pattern that has been seen with other insurgent groups around the world, most specifically the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, better known as the FARC. A very similar transformation from an ideological insurgency into one that is just crime-fueled.
You know, before 9/11, we used to often talk about the war on drugs. I think that was a term coined by President Richard Nixon in the late 60s. And then after 9/11, of course, George Bush coined the term war on terror. It seems as if these two wars have now become one.
Right, the perfect storm. I think it's a very worrisome situation because you have criminal groups along the border increasingly cooperating with insurgent and extremist groups, and call it what you want, but it's a very, very dangerous situation over there.
Now, as we were saying at the outset of the program, most of this poppy crop is situated in the south of Afghanistan, in Helmand province. Do these people who are involved in growing this crop, are they also involved in processing the crop into heroin?
Well, I think it's not correct at this point to say that the insurgents are actually running the drugs trade. I think there are traffickers and smuggling cartels that have run this business for decades in the border areas. The insurgents at this point are still servicing it, providing protection, taking taxes, collecting fees for protecting the trade at different points. Of course, this also happened in Colombia, and eventually the FARC insurgency there just took over the trade themselves. But so far that hasn't happened in the Afghan and Pakistan area. But it's important, I think, that we switch the focus. The focus of counter-narcotics campaigns has always been on the farmlands and trying to stop the farmers from growing poppy, or the Bush administration wanted to spray the fields. I think the focus needs to be on trying to stop the money that's getting to the insurgents and trying to cut off these very powerful smuggling groups from the enormous profits they're earning.
And under the old approach, it appeared that the United States government, for instance, looked at these problems as two separate problems, as there being one a problem with the insurgents and another the problem with drugs being grown in this country. Do you think there is now recognition that this is the same problem?
Yes, I think there's now recognition with the Obama administration that they have to fight the insurgency and the drug problem as one problem. You don't hear the drug traffickers saying, I'm not going to work with that guy, he's an extremist. They're all cooperating, and therefore our law enforcement efforts must be better joined with our counterinsurgency efforts. I had the privilege last week in Washington of briefing a lot of senior officials on this issue, and they were very receptive to what I have to say. To me, the biggest challenge now is not that NATO's enemy in the region is making hundreds of millions of dollars off the drugs trade. It's that our allies in the region, both governments, the government of Afghanistan and the government of Pakistan, are both deeply corrupted by the drugs trade. It's very hard to find reliable partners.
I want to come to that in a moment, but we've just received a question here in our chat room. This is from Patrick, and he's in Washington, D.C., and he says, what strategies are being used now to stop the production of opium, and how are they different from previous failed strategies?
Well, that's an interesting question. They have just 4 months ago, NATO commanders got the mandate to actually destroy drug refineries. Incredibly, there was such a division between law enforcement and counterinsurgency methods that NATO troops were not allowed to destroy drug labs, even though that's one of the biggest ways that the insurgents earn taxes and protection money is protecting these labs. Just over the weekend, NATO released a statement saying they had overrun a major Taliban stronghold in Marja in southern Helmand province. They were able there to confiscate 92 tons of drugs that had been stockpiled there. 92 tons, that is an astounding quantity. It's the second largest drug haul in history, and the largest was last year also in Afghanistan.
And I presume that is an indication that they are enjoying some success.
Well, yes, but I call for I personally think there should be a strategy where we go after the drug labs, where we go after the drug convoys, and leave the farmers alone. The bottom of the price is falling out of the opium prices are collapsing across the country. Farmers on their own are choosing to plant other crops because it just isn't the moneymaker that it used to be. I think we need to leave the farmers alone, try to get the people of Afghanistan, rural Afghanistan, on our side, and focus our efforts on the traffickers and the insurgents and extremist groups that are profiting so greatly off of this drug trade.
You mentioned just a few minutes ago that it is extremely poor governance and corruption in a country like Afghanistan that is contributing to this problem. I'm wondering if you could just outline for us how it contributes to this proliferation of drugs and how the money is moving back to insurgent groups like the Taliban.
Well, in my study, in my book, I don't specifically study the corruption issue. However, I have been shown reports by the UN and State Department cables, classified reports that talk about corruption that goes right up to the top ranks of the Afghan police in particular. Massive monthly payments that go up the chain of command. And the traffickers are often the intermediaries who will negotiate to get a drug shipment through between government-held areas and areas where the insurgents hold sway. And what that means is that the foreign troops who are there are essentially fighting and dying in many cases for the same territory over and over and over again. And it's really more a problem of corruption than an issue of the insurgency being so powerful or supported by the general public. The horror stories that are filtering out, not just in southern Afghanistan, but also in Pakistan, where the Pakistani Taliban have taken over, indicate that there is a groundswell of opposition to the insurgents in these areas. And I think the reason we're not seeing more success is not because the insurgents are so strong or so well liked. They're not. It's because the governments in both countries are corrupt and unable to fight this problem.
And what is the Pakistani role if the drugs are getting out through Pakistan? Is the government just looking the other way?
Well, we talk a lot about corruption within the Afghan government, and there's been a lot of talk about people like Ahmed Wali Karzai, the brother of President Karzai, being a facilitator of the drugs trade. There's been very little discussion in the media or in the public realm about drug corruption in Pakistan. But what I found over the course of my study, looking again through government archives, interviewing officials who have been in the Pakistani government and also have served in embassies there for the past 3 decades, there have long been accusations of high-level drug corruption, both within the Pakistan military, within their intelligence services. These have not been investigated. There have been cases where the Pakistan government has cracked down on individual officers who were caught smuggling drugs, particularly a couple cases in the 1980s when officers were arrested and then mysteriously escaped. But there has been very, very little investigation, and on neither side of the border has any senior official been arrested, tried, much less brought to justice over recent accusations of involvement in the drugs trade.
We're talking to Gretchen Peters, author of the book Seeds of Terror: How Heroin is Bankrolling the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. But right now we're going to take a short break. More of our discussion with Ms. Peters in a moment. As we pause, let me remind you that you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debate taking place there right now. We'll be right back.